Hi everyone, so one video has become 3 videos. We're still going to try and work through these adaptations in terms of fact, extension, the impact that these adaptations have, and then a practical example. But we're starting with the cardiovascular system this time and the adaptations of the heart to predominantly endurance training. So we get hypertrophy on the left side of the heart. That's this side, and we know this side is the one that increases it or sends blood flow to the rest of the body. It does this because the left wall of the ventricle becomes a lot thicker. It's more muscly, it's more elastic, so it can stretch further, so you get greater diastolic filling. It can contract with more force, so the blood flow is quicker going out to the skeletal muscle, which on this one stretches further. Essentially, as when you're resting, the heart is bigger and can pump more blood with one pump. That's stroke volume, and therefore the cardiac output increases as well, because that's your stroke volume times the number of times the heart beats in 1 minute. Because it's more efficient at getting that blood out. And don't forget, you've got more capillaries, you've got more myoglobin, you've got more hemoglobin, you've got more red blood cells. All of these sorts of changes have happened as well. So you're so much more efficient at getting that oxygen into the muscle cell. So therefore the heart, when you're resting, just doesn't need to beat as much. We're getting enough nutrients, enough oxygen into the body, so the heart rate can start to reduce. And this is called bradycardia. That's a term that you need to be aware of. So it's a reduced resting heart rate, a slower resting heart rate, due to the hypertrophy of the left side of the heart. So the volumes all increase, so that's stroke volume, which I said amount of blood in 1 beat, cardiac output, the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricle over 1 minute. We increase our numbers of red blood cells, and if we're increasing the number of red blood cells, we are increasing the numbers of hemoglobin as well. And this results in reduced resting heart rate, the bradycardia that we've just mentioned, which is down to an increased parasympathetic activity of the sinoatrial node. That was on the heart, the pacemaker of the heart that initially sends out those electrical impulses for the cardiac cycle. Now, because your heart is able to withstand more exercise, more beating, it now has an increased maximum heart rate. So although the resting heart rate is lower, when you're exercising, you need as much oxygen as you can get, so you can work at as high intensity as possible to make you faster, to make you jump higher, to make you better in the 70th minute of the match. So the maximum heart rate does increase as well. Blood composition changes, so what's within this blood? Now, we have spoken already about the red blood cells increasing, and that increases our hemoglobin levels, but we've also got increased proteins in the blood plasma, and this increases so we can retain water better and keep hydrated better. And we know from section 1, I think section A, that this makes blood flow more efficient if it has lower viscosity, if it's thin. If it's thick and gloopy, it sticks, it doesn't go fast, it doesn't go everywhere it needs to go, and it doesn't carry the oxygen efficiently. If it's more like water, so it has a lower viscosity, it's going to travel faster and more efficiently around the body. And that can happen with these extra proteins. Now, that comes from endurance exercise. So the diffusion rate, this is referring to the capillaries because they're part of our cardiovascular system, they're the vessels. The diffusion rate is increased because we've got a number of capillaries around these alveoli. So if this is an alveoli here, and we are averagely fit, there you go, there's our capillaries that we've got. After about 8 weeks of training, endurance training, we're going to have grown capillaries. And we're not just going to grow them around the alveoli, we're going to grow those around the muscle cell as well. So we're going to have more capillaries around the outside of the muscle cell. If we've got more capillaries, we can therefore drop off more carbon dioxide and collect more oxygen, which is what exercise is all about. As long as we can keep doing that, we can keep working hard. The faster we can keep doing that, the higher intensity of exercise we'll be able to cope with, and for an increased duration. So it delivers nutrients like glucose, oxygen, and removes waste such as carbon dioxide. So the blood pressure. So after 8 weeks of training, we actually have a our resting blood pressure is reduced somewhat. And this is because the resistance on the artery wall is slightly reduced. So we have resting blood pressure reduces, and exercise pressure tends to stay the same because of all of the adaptations that we've got. Yes, the heart is beating with more force and beating more blood, but we've made changes to our vessels as well, so they're stronger, they're able to cope with it. So actually our blood pressure doesn't go up because of it. We just adapt to cope with those higher levels, and it just distributes the blood more effectively than it did before. So next section in the neuromuscular section. So this is C5, neuromuscular system. So you remember the motor unit, which is your neuron and all of the muscle fibres that it is attached to. That's your motor unit. And we had big units and small units, and we look at something, try and decide how heavy it is, and we recruit the right number of motor units. We recruit the right size of motor unit. So if we're lifting something heavy, we recruit a large motor unit, or we might recruit many of those motor units. If we need it powerfully, we will send more nervous impulses. So we get a more powerful lift or a more powerful force. So that's recruitment. Now, over a period of 8 weeks, and this can be through endurance training, but more so during the resistance training, we can actually get better at recruiting. So we're better at recruiting the most appropriate type of unit that we want. So the right unit size in the right places. So this unit size, very important. It makes us more accurate. It makes us be able to respond quicker. And it's able to pick the appropriate fibre type, so your type 1, 2As, and your type 2, Xs. So the muscle can also contract with more force after a period of resistance training because the number of neurotransmitters has increased. And if you remember, some of those neurotransmitters will come from testosterone, which is a hormone that's released when we do resistance training. And that helps to transfer the nervous impulse into the muscle fibres. If we've got more of those, then we can contract with more force, and we do get more of those with regular training. Muscles work at a higher intensity than before. So this is a new term, nervous inhibition. It sounds a lot posher than it is. It's to do with our spindles and our Golgi tendon organs, and then being our safety mechanisms. And what we actually do here is we can learn to desensitize them and not turn them off, but reduce their reaction. Now, this is really important in your antagonistic muscle. So imagine this. You're running up to take a penalty in football, and you need to be able to contract your quadricep muscle to extend the lower leg to take a big strike on the ball. You need it to be the most powerful strike you can do. Now, your hamstring is your antagonist to your quadricep, which is your agonist. The antagonist holds some tension in it, some contraction in it. It does this to protect the knee joint, to stop you from just swinging it as hard as you can and, not overstretching, but over moving that joint. Because obviously if you did something like that, you do ligament damage, tendon damage, possibly cartilage. So the body protects the antagonist by keeping it contracted slightly. When you train, it gets used to what you can do, and it stops that contraction, or it reduces that contraction. Now, a reduction in the contraction of the antagonistic muscle, the hamstring, means that the quadricep when it does contract, can contract with more force. And this is nervous inhibition. This is the muscles of the antagonist being told to contract less. So section C6, we've got the endocrine system, our hormonal system. So adrenaline or noradrenaline, they're the same thing. Secretion is increased and therefore makes breathing rate and heart rate go up even more than it would for somebody who is sedentary or has a basic level of fitness. Why is this useful for us? Well, first of all, it's going to redistribute the blood to the working muscles a lot faster, which means oxygen, nutrients, which is a win-win situation for us. Gets the heart rate and breathing rate up quicker. We can start using our aerobic system to a faster rate sooner than somebody else, which means we will hit our lactate threshold later than somebody else because we've been using our aerobic system quickly much earlier on. So we're actually more prepared for the game. So that means when we're starting our race or we're starting our match, we're going to be more prepared for it. Cortisol, our stress hormone. Now, two different things happen with this. In strength training, it can increase the glucose available for exercise, which we need because we use that glucose in the lactate system. We will use the lactate system towards mid to end of our training session in the gym, even if we're lifting heavy weights. In response to endurance training, our cortisol will actually reduce. Reduces the effects of the stress, and it can have benefits that we've done in A6 as well, where we might sleep better, for example. So testosterone and human growth hormone predominantly changes as a result of strength training again, and increased frequency and volume of testosterone. So we get it more often and we will get more of it when we do, and that directly impacts the amount of human growth hormone we're going to release. The more of this testosterone we have, the more we can synthesize protein to repair and grow our muscle fibers. If we're repairing and we're growing our muscle fibers, our size of our muscles is going to increase, and that word hypertrophy has come up again. So to make them bigger and more. Right, let's have a look at energy systems then. So we will get increased adenosine triphosphate in the muscle cells. So just what's in the muscle cell ready and waiting for us the minute we start activity. So we'll have more of that available for instantaneous energy. Phosphocreatine stores are going to increase, which has the impact of when we're at the gym, if we're doing high intensity, because that's what we use the ATP PC system for. If we've got increased phosphocreatine stores, we can do a higher intensity activity for just a little bit longer. And that might mean, well, it does mean then that we can train a little bit more, which means we're going to get bigger gains at the end of it. We're going to get better protein synthesis and hypertrophy. We increase the amount of creatine kinase that we get. That's an anaerobic enzyme because it's only used in the ATP-PC system. If you remember, it broke up the bond between phosphate and creatine, so we could use that energy in the phosphate to resynthesize ATP. Now, creatine kinase will increase. So that means for our increased stores of phosphocreatine, we've got more enzyme, which means we should be able to break it down faster so we can get the energy even quicker than we had it before. So faster contractions. Aerobic enzymes will increase. Now they helped us all the way through glycolysis. They help us in the Krebs cycle and in the electron transport chain. So if we've got more enzymes, the enzymes are things that make things happen. The ASEs. So that if we've got more of them, those, or that breakdown of glucose, that breakdown of fat through the aerobic system is going to happen a lot quicker, and through the lactate system because the glycolysis happens for both. The mitochondria, the numbers and the size of them will increase in the muscle cell. Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. If we've got more mitochondria and they're bigger in size, we can restore more ATP through the aerobic system. And essentially that's all we ever want. Because if our aerobic system is so advanced that we can absorb a huge amount of oxygen and we can make that oxygen resynthesize ATP, why would we need the lactate system or the ATP-PC system? I mean, of course we're going to use them because we're always looking to go faster or higher or more powerful, but it does mean that we can offset using those systems, so we can achieve a lot more with the aerobic system than we did before. Increased buffering capacity. Now, if you remember, we don't need to know the ins and outs, but it's to do with bicarbonate and to do with these hydrogens from the lactic acid. But essentially, what we need to regurgitate for the exam is we get greater buffering capacity. That means we can neutralise that hydrogen in the bloodstream. And if we can do that, we can actually create more lactic acid before we have to stop. Metabolism of fats increases, and this is to do with the oxidation of fats. So this was, I would have drawn this on the board like so. There's our glycolysis, there's our Krebs cycle, there's our electron transport chain, and in here I had coming fats, and I had oxygen popping in through there at the bottom of glycolysis, so that's here. Now, if we can get more oxygen in, which we can, we've got more myoglobin, more hemoglobin, more blood volume, we've got greater capillarization around the muscle cell, around the alveoli, so we've got heaps more oxygen inside that muscle cell now. If we then bring the fats in through this route as well, it goes through something called beta oxidation, which we don't need to know for our specification, but there's plenty more oxygen to break this fat down. If we break this fat down more economically speaking, more efficiently, then we don't need to use up our limited glycogen stores. And we all know that our body does prefer the glycogen stores to use. So the longer that we can maintain those stores, the better the output for us, the higher intensity exercise we can do for longer. Just to remind you that when you run out of when you run out of glycogen and glucose, you cannot burn fat on their own. But the less glycogen and glucose that you burn, the less fats you can burn, and essentially the less muscle contraction you have. So you'll really start to feel the effects of fatigue when glycogen as an energy source runs out. So a little bit of a new section here. We're looking at the respiratory exchange ratio. So we're looking at our ability to use fuels. So first of all, it's worth remembering that we use carbohydrate, glycogen, glucose in higher intensity activities because we need to break it down quickly. We use fat when we're walking or sitting around because it takes so much oxygen to break it down. And when I say it's not just fat, as we've just discussed, but you use a higher percentage of fat when you're doing low intensity activities. If you're working somewhere in between, then we will use combined fats and carbohydrates. Now, someone's come along and said, yes, we agree with this, but we can prove that this happens. And they came up with a respiratory exchange ratio. And what it is it's the amount of carbon dioxide produced. So they're reading the amount of carbon dioxide you're producing. And let's not forget how carbon dioxide is produced. And it is produced specifically in Krebs cycle, which is specifically part of the aerobic system. So we're looking at the amount of CO2 we breathe out in comparison to the amount of oxygen that we are taking in. So it's this here. Carbon dioxide divided by amount of oxygen, and we get a number, and it's not a big number. If the number is nearer 1, it shows that we are burning carbohydrate. If the number is lower and nearer 0.7, it shows that we're burning fat, and somewhere in between at about 0.85. So what does that mean? So someone's on the treadmill and they're running, and you're analysing what they're breathing in and what they're breathing out. You can say to them, you're using your aerobic system. You can basically see how hard that person is working, but you can also test and look at the efficiency of their aerobic system. Because if they're having to switch from fats to carbohydrates quite quickly in the race, then it's going to show that they haven't got a particularly high level of fitness. Okay, last few slides then. We're looking at measurement of the body systems and their contribution to sport and exercise. So we're looking to measure the aerobic system, and we're going to do the VO2 max test. The VO2 max test is on a treadmill, and it reads the amount of oxygen you breathe in and carbon dioxide you breathe out. It's called a direct gas analysis test. And you are looking to see how much oxygen the body can actually absorb. So it's all the same amount of oxygen out in the atmosphere, and we breathe the same quantities into our lungs. But how much can we actually extract from our lungs and then use? And that's important, because someone who has a very efficient aerobic system will absorb a lot more of that oxygen. So it's looking at what is going in and what is coming out. Now, weight bearing activities have quite a significant impact on VO2 max as opposed to non-weight bearing. So running and jogging will have a bigger impact on the volume of oxygen that you can absorb than non-weight bearing, like swimming, for example. Anaerobic threshold. So this is working at higher intensities using the lactate system. So it's looking to see, or you're looking to test, at what point you cannot use the lactate system anymore. How long does it work for, and what does it enable you to do? So as we know, the lactic acid system leads us to have an increase in hydrogen in the blood. And trained athletes can tolerate much higher levels of hydrogen in there because of the buffering and because they can just tolerate higher levels. So therefore, if they can tolerate this higher level of lactate in the system, or they can buffer that those hydrogen ions, then they're going to be able to work it in higher intensities for longer. Now, they test this with a finger prick, and they will test the amount of lactate in the blood. And what they're looking to do, so they'll put you through a fitness test where it's incremental, so you're walking, then running on a treadmill, similar to the VO2 max test, and they will at regular intervals check the amount of lactate in your blood. So it will tell them at what point you've got so much lactate in your blood that you're not able to get rid of it. So it's building faster than you can get rid of it, like the onset of blood lactate accumulation. And they will tell you at what percentage of your VO2 max that happens. Right, there's a few tests here, and I would thoroughly recommend, just like the VO2 max test and the anaerobic threshold test, that you look these up to see these experiments being done. Right, so anaerobic power is a test of power, obviously, and meaning or looking at the how much high intensity work somebody can actually do. So it's related to either your strength or speed training. Now, there are lots to do. You would have done the vertical jump. You would have definitely done it in fitness lessons or sports hall athletics, when you stand at the side of the wall and put your arm up to the side and you have a bit of chalk line and you jump up, and then you measure the distance between, so it's measuring the power in your legs. The Wingate test is a cycling based test, and the Sargent is a jump test, but can you look those up? But essentially we're just measuring the amount of force and the speed of that force of contraction in a set of muscle groups. So the strength, to test strength, we would do a 1 rep max. So you'd go into the gym, you'd lift a weight, and it would be as heavy a weight as you could lift. And you would lift it just once, but you do need to lift it properly. And obviously over time you would see that weight would increase. So finally we come to muscular endurance. And there's loads of tests you can do for this. So you could do a press up test. You could time how many you could do in 1 minute. You could do a sit-up bleep test. So a beep comes up and you've got to sit up to the beep, and it's an exhaustive test. So you can do how many repetitions you can do in a certain period of time and compare yourself week after week. Or you could do it to exhaustion, like the bleep sit-up that I mentioned, where it just keeps going and it gets faster and faster and faster, and you record the level that you drop out. And that's it for section C. If there was any of it that you didn't understand why that's happened, then please go back to section A. These are predominantly long answers, long answer questions, sort of your 8 and your 10 markers. So make sure we've remembered that fact, extension, impact, and then a practical example. Thank you very much.